Deep in the shadow-draped hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like unspoken prayers, there exists a darkness that predates European settlement, a darkness that whispers through twisted laurel thickets and echoes from limestone caves where no echo should exist. These are not the familiar terrors of modern horror films or urban legends shared around campfires. These are the inherited sins of families who discovered that survival in the mountains sometimes requires bargains with forces that have no names and accept no refusal. Between 1850 and 1950, 9 distinct religious movements emerged from the isolated valleys of Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Movements that began as desperate attempts to find meaning in lives marked by poverty, illness, and endless struggle. But what started as prayer circles and healing gatherings evolved into something far more sinister, something that transformed entire bloodlines into vessels for practices so disturbing that federal investigators who encountered them either resigned immediately or disappeared entirely. The mountains remember everything. They remember the Cherokee, who once declared certain peaks forbidden ground, places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. They remember the first European settlers who ignored those warnings and built their cabins on cursed soil. Most importantly, they remember the families who chose to embrace what they found there rather than flee from it. These 9 cults didn't recruit members through charismatic leaders or apocalyptic prophecies. They grew organically from the mountain communities themselves, rooted in bloodlines that stretched back generations. Families who passed down their dark knowledge, like heirloom recipes, teaching their children that survival required understanding the true nature of the ancient peaks that surrounded them. What makes these groups particularly chilling is how they wove themselves into the fabric of Appalachian life. They weren't isolated compounds hidden from society. They were the shopkeepers, the midwives, the traveling preachers, and the local healers that everyone depended on. They attended regular church services on Sundays and participated in community gatherings, all while maintaining their true worship in hidden groves and limestone caverns when the moon went dark. The first documented encounter with what investigators later termed hereditary mountain cults occurred in 1923, when a census taker named Margaret Thornfield disappeared while documenting families in the remote sections of Pike County, Kentucky. Her horse was found 3 days later, standing calmly beside a creek, still saddled but without its rider. The only clue to her fate was a leather satchel containing her census notes, which had been meticulously altered. Every family name had been changed, every birth date modified, every record of their existence as systematically falsified. When federal marshals arrived to investigate, they discovered something that challenged their understanding of how isolated communities could organize themselves. The families in Margaret's territory had created an elaborate system of false identities, fake genealogies, and fabricated histories that stretched back decades. But more disturbing was what they found in the caves and clearings where these families gathered. Stone altars worn smooth by generations of use, symbols carved into living trees that continued to grow around the wounds, incorporating the markings into their bark. Most unsettling were the genealogical charts etched into cave walls, family trees that traced bloodlines not through marriages and births, but through shared participation in rituals that the investigators couldn't bring themselves to document in their official reports. The patterns that emerged from subsequent investigations revealed a network of interconnected families who had maintained their practices for over a century. They had survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, industrialization, and the Great Depression by adapting their beliefs to changing circumstances while never abandoning their core convictions. They believed that the mountains themselves were alive, conscious entities that required specific forms of worship and sacrifice to maintain the delicate balance between the world of the living and whatever existed beyond. Each cult developed its own interpretation of this fundamental belief, creating distinct practices that reflected their particular geography and family history. Some focused on healing rituals that came with terrible prices. Others sought to commune with entities they believed dwelt in the deepest caves and highest peaks. A few attempted to preserve their family consciousness across generations through practices that violated every understanding of death and individual identity. What united them all was their absolute conviction that they were the guardians of ancient knowledge, the keepers of traditions that predated Christianity and would outlast any government or institution that tried to interfere with their way of life. They viewed themselves not as cultists or criminals, but as the inheritors of a sacred responsibility to maintain the proper relationship between humanity and the forces that truly controlled the mountains. The federal investigations that began in the 1920s and continued sporadically through the 1970s produced thousands of pages of documentation that remain classified to this day. What little information has been declassified reveals a consistent pattern of investigators encountering phenomena that challenge their understanding of reality itself. Equipment malfunctions in specific locations, witnesses whose testimony changed dramatically between interviews, physical evidence that seemed to alter its properties when removed from mountain locations. More troubling were the investigators themselves. Of the 43 federal agents who worked on these cases over 5 decades, 7 disappeared entirely, 12 resigned from government service and moved to locations far from Appalachia, and 18 reported health problems that medical professionals couldn't explain or treat. The remaining 6 agents completed their service, but left behind personal journals describing experiences that their official reports never mentioned. Dr. Elizabeth Cartwright, a psychiatrist who interviewed surviving cult members in the 1960s, wrote in her private notes that the subjects displayed a form of collective memory that seemed to transcend individual experience. They could describe events that occurred before their birth with perfect accuracy, speak in dialects that linguists couldn't identify, and demonstrate knowledge of local geography that surpassed professional surveyors who had spent years mapping the region. Most disturbing was their relationship with time itself. Dr. Cartwright noted that subjects seemed to experience past, present, and future as simultaneous rather than sequential. They would speak of deceased family members as though they were still alive, describe future events with casual certainty, and display an understanding of historical patterns that suggested they viewed human existence from a perspective that transcended normal temporal boundaries. The mountain communities where these cults flourished remain largely unchanged today. Modern technology has brought cell phone towers and internet access to some areas, but the deepest hollows still exist in a state of isolation that allows old traditions to persist. Local law enforcement maintains an informal policy of avoiding certain territories during specific times of year, particularly around the winter solstice and the spring equinox, when historical incidents were most likely to occur. Hikers and researchers who venture into these areas report consistent anomalies, compasses that spin wildly in specific locations, GPS devices that place them in impossible coordinates, photographs that reveal details not visible to the naked eye. Most commonly, they describe an overwhelming sense of being observed by something that remains just beyond the edge of perception. The 9 cults documented in federal files represent only the groups that investigators managed to identify and study. Local historians estimate that dozens of similar family-based religious movements existed throughout Appalachia, most of which successfully concealed their practices from outside scrutiny. Some may continue to exist today, their traditions passed down through bloodlines that have learned to adapt to modern surveillance and investigation techniques. What makes these groups particularly dangerous is not their isolation or their rejection of mainstream society. It's their patience. Unlike conventional cults that seek immediate transformation or apocalyptic change, these mountain families think in terms of generations. They plant seeds of influence that may not bloom for decades, create networks of obligation and debt that bind communities together across centuries, and maintain their practices through periods of apparent dormancy that can last for human lifetimes. The mountains keep their secrets well. Even today, with satellite imagery and a digital communication, there are valleys in Appalachia where no official maps exist, where census takers have never ventured, where the old ways continue undisturbed. In these places, the 9 cults we're about to explore may represent not historical curiosities, but active threats that have simply learned to hide more effectively. As we delve into their individual stories, remember that these are not tales of primitive superstition or isolated madness. These are accounts of intelligent, organized groups who discovered something in the ancient mountains that changed their understanding of reality itself, something that convinced them that their survival and perhaps the survival of the world depended on maintaining practices that the outside world would never understand or accept. The first cult we'll examine emerged from a single family's desperate attempt to survive the harsh winter of 1847, when starvation drove them to seek help from sources that should have remained undisturbed. What they found in the depths of a sealed cave would transform not just their own bloodline, but the entire understanding of what was possible in the shadow of the ancient peaks. This knowledge seeps into bloodlines through generations, creating hereditary practices that defy modern understanding. By the 1890s, 3 additional family lines had emerged across the Appalachian Ridge, each discovering their own pathways to power through increasingly desperate circumstances. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern that federal investigators would later term the Appalachian Awakening, a period when multiple families simultaneously encountered forces that would bind their descendants for generations to come. The emergence of these additional bloodlines coincided with the harshest economic conditions the region had ever experienced. The Panic of 1893 devastated mountain communities already struggling with isolation and poverty. Families faced impossible choices: watch their children starve, or venture into territories their ancestors had marked as forbidden. Three separate lineages made the same fateful decision, each approaching different aspects of the same ancient presence that seemed to permeate the deepest hollows of Appalachian wilderness. What makes these later cults particularly disturbing is how they learned from the mistakes of the earlier families. Unlike the Holloways, who maintained obvious supernatural elements in their mining operations, or the Carvers, whose timber success defied natural explanation, these newer groups developed sophisticated methods of concealment. They understood that survival required invisibility, that their practices must appear completely ordinary to outside observers while maintaining the terrible bargains that sustained them. The sixth cult, known only through fragmentary records as the Keepers of the Deep Spring, established themselves in the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee during the winter of 1895. Unlike other families who sought wealth or healing, the Keepers pursued knowledge. Their patriarch, Dr. Erasmus Blackwood, had been a respected physician in Knoxville before a series of unexplained patient deaths destroyed his practice and drove him into exile. Facing professional ruin and personal bankruptcy, he retreated to the mountains with his extended family, carrying only his medical instruments and a collection of books on anatomy and natural philosophy. The Blackwood family initially survived by providing basic medical care to isolated mountain communities. However, Dr. Blackwood's treatments began incorporating elements that had no basis in conventional medicine. He claimed to have discovered a natural spring whose waters possessed extraordinary healing properties, but only when combined with specific ritualistic preparations. Patients who drank from his specially prepared tonics experienced miraculous recoveries from ailments that should have been fatal. The reality was far more sinister. Dr. Blackwood had indeed found a spring, but its waters ran black as ink and emerged from a cave system that extended deep into the mountain's core. The spring's unusual properties became apparent during his first, desperate winter when his youngest daughter fell critically ill with consumption. In a moment of parental desperation, he carried her to the spring and begged whatever forces might be listening to spare her life. The response came not as words, but as understanding. The spring would heal, but it required payment in the form of life force drawn from others. Dr. Blackwood's medical knowledge allowed him to perfect a technique of gradual extraction, draining vitality from his patients in amounts small enough to avoid immediate detection while accumulating enough life energy to power the spring's healing properties for his own family. The Keepers developed an intricate system of patient rotation, ensuring that no single community suffered too many mysterious deaths. They established remote clinics throughout the region, with family members serving as traveling physicians who would treat patients with the spring water, then move on before the delayed effects became apparent. Patients initially felt remarkably improved, but within months they would begin aging rapidly, their hair turning white, their skin developing a translucent quality, their bodies failing as their life force had been permanently diminished. What made the Keepers particularly effective was their genuine medical knowledge combined with their supernatural resources. They could cure diseases that other doctors couldn't even diagnose, making them invaluable to communities that had no other medical options. Their reputation for miraculous healing spread throughout the region, and desperate families would travel for days to seek their treatment, unknowingly contributing to the cycle that sustained the Blackwood family's longevity. The seventh cult emerged from the harsh realities of subsistence farming in the most remote areas of western North Carolina. The Ashford family had worked the same mountainous land for 3 generations, watching their yields diminish year after year as the soil became increasingly barren. By 1897, they faced complete crop failure and starvation. The family patriarch, Silas Ashford, had exhausted every conventional farming technique and faced the prospect of watching his family starve during the coming winter. In desperation, Silas ventured into the deepest part of his property, an area his grandfather had always forbidden the family to cultivate. There, in a natural clearing surrounded by ancient trees, he discovered why the land had remained untouched. The soil was black and rich, but it moved with a life of its own, occasionally forming small mounds that rose and fell like breathing. Plants grew in this soil with supernatural vitality, but they twisted into unnatural shapes and bore fruit that looked normal but tasted of copper and decay. The Ashfords learned to work with this living soil through a process they called the feeding. Each planting season, they would bring offerings to the black earth, small animals at first, then larger livestock, and eventually, when the crops were most crucial, human blood drawn from family members in carefully measured amounts. The soil responded to these offerings by producing harvests of extraordinary abundance, but the crops carried a subtle influence that affected anyone who consumed them. Communities that purchased Ashford produce reported unusual dreams and behavioral changes. Children became unusually obedient. Adults experienced vivid nightmares featuring the same recurring imagery of underground tunnels and vast caverns filled with moving shadows. More disturbing, families who regularly consumed Ashford crops began experiencing synchronized thoughts and emotions, as if their individual consciousness was gradually merging into a collective mind. The Ashfords themselves underwent the most dramatic transformation. After decades of working the black soil, they developed an ability to communicate without speaking, sharing thoughts and sensations across vast distances. Their physical appearance changed as well. Their skin took on a grayish hue, their eyes became completely black, and their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they were no longer entirely individual beings, but parts of a larger organism. The eighth cult, the Thornfield family, discovered their path to power through music and sound. As traveling musicians who performed at gatherings throughout the Appalachian region, they had always possessed unusual musical abilities. However, their talents took on a supernatural dimension after they became trapped in a cave system during a severe storm in 1899. While sheltering in the depths, they discovered that certain combinations of sounds and rhythms produced tangible effects on their environment. The cave system contained natural acoustic properties that amplified and modified sound in impossible ways. When the family played their instruments in specific chambers, the music would resonate through the rock itself, creating vibrations that could be felt for miles. More remarkably, these musical sessions began attracting response from something deep within the mountain. The responses came as harmonies that seemed to emerge from the stone itself, creating compositions of such beauty and complexity that they transcended normal human musical understanding. The Thornfields learned to incorporate these supernatural harmonies into their performances, creating music that possessed almost hypnotic power over audiences. Their concerts became legendary throughout the region, with listeners reporting experiences that ranged from religious ecstasy to complete temporal displacement. Some audience members claimed to have experienced entire lifetimes during a single performance, living through decades of memories that felt completely real but had never actually occurred. However, the true purpose of the Thornfield performances was far more sinister than entertainment. The music served as a form of harvesting, drawing emotional and spiritual energy from audiences and channeling it back to the presence dwelling within the mountain cave. The more intense the audience's emotional response, the more energy was collected. The Thornfields became skilled at manipulating crowds through their music, guiding listeners through carefully orchestrated emotional journeys that left them drained but euphoric. The family's musical abilities came at a significant cost. Each generation of Thornfield musicians aged rapidly, their bodies unable to withstand the supernatural forces they channeled through their instruments. Most died before reaching 40, but they passed their knowledge to their children through a process that involved more than conventional teaching. Young Thornfields were brought to the cave system and subjected to the same harmonic influences that had originally transformed the family, ensuring that each generation possessed the same supernatural musical abilities. The ninth and final cult, the Ravens Hollow family, established their power through the most direct and violent means. Unlike other families who discovered their supernatural connections through desperation or accident, the Ravens Hollows actively sought out dark forces. Led by the ruthless patriarch Malcolm Ravens Hollow, they had already established a reputation for violence and criminality before their supernatural transformation. Malcolm had been a Confederate deserter who turned to banditry after the Civil War, leading a gang that terrorized travelers throughout the region. However, conventional criminal activities became increasingly difficult as law enforcement improved and communities organized better defenses. Facing mounting pressure from federal marshals and local militias, Malcolm sought more reliable sources of power and protection. The Ravens Hollows discovered their supernatural patron through deliberate human sacrifice. During a particularly harsh winter, when their gang was trapped in a remote valley, Malcolm ordered the execution of several captured prisoners as an offering to whatever dark forces might be listening. The ritual was crude but effective. The victims were arranged in a circle around a natural stone formation, their blood allowed to pool in the depression at the center. The response was immediate and terrifying. The stone formation cracked open, revealing a passage that descended into absolute darkness. From this opening emerged a presence that communicated through direct mental contact, offering the Ravens Hollows power and protection in exchange for continued offerings of human life. Unlike other cults that maintained some pretense of civilized behavior, the Ravens Hollows embraced their role as predators, using their supernatural abilities to hunt and kill with impunity. The family developed abilities that made them extraordinarily effective killers. They could move through the wilderness with supernatural stealth, track victims across vast distances, and anticipate their prey's movements with uncanny accuracy. Most disturbing, they gained the ability to induce paralyzing fear in their victims, rendering them helpless through sheer psychological terror. The Ravens Hollows operated throughout the early 20th century, responsible for dozens of disappearances across multiple states. Their methods were brutal and ritualistic, with victims' bodies arranged in specific patterns that served both as offerings to their patron and as warnings to potential interference. Law enforcement agencies struggled to combat them because conventional investigative techniques proved useless against their supernatural abilities. These 9 cults represent the complete spectrum of Appalachian supernatural practice, from the desperate survival tactics of the Hollowways to the calculated predation of the Ravens Hollows. Each family found their own path to power, but all shared common elements: isolation, desperation, and willingness to sacrifice conventional morality for supernatural advantage. Their influence extended far beyond their immediate communities, creating networks of fear and dependence that shaped the cultural development of entire regions. What makes these cults particularly significant is how they adapted to changing times while maintaining their core practices. As the 20th century progressed and modern communication systems made isolation increasingly difficult to maintain, these families developed sophisticated methods of concealment and misdirection. They learned to operate within modern society while preserving the ancient bargains that sustained them. The federal investigations that began in the 1920s represented the first serious attempt to understand and combat these supernatural criminal organizations. However, investigators quickly discovered that conventional law enforcement techniques were inadequate when dealing with entities that possessed abilities beyond normal human understanding. Equipment failures, altered memories, and unexplained phenomena plagued every investigation, leading to a policy of containment rather than elimination. Today, descendants of these 9 families continue to operate throughout the Appalachian region. Their practices evolved, but their fundamental nature unchanged. They represent a hidden aspect of American history, a reminder that in the deepest hollows of ancient mountains, older laws than those written by human hands still hold sway. Their story serves as both historical record and warning that desperation can drive people to make bargains whose true cost becomes clear only when it's too late to escape the terms of payment. The Hollow Men of Shady Grove first appeared in Pike County records in 1907, a mysterious congregation that settled in the abandoned mining town after the copper veins ran dry. What made them different wasn't just their unusual appearance, though locals whispered about their uncommonly pale skin and the way their eyes reflected light like polished coins. It was their silence that unnerved everyone. The Hollow Men, as they came to be known, never spoke above a whisper, and when they did communicate, it was in a dialect that seemed to blend Cherokee, Old Welsh, and something else entirely, something that made listeners' teeth ache. The congregation was led by a figure known only as Father Matthias, a gaunt man whose age seemed to shift depending on the light. In daylight, he appeared to be in his 30s, but in the flickering glow of oil lamps, witnesses swore he looked ancient, his face bearing the weight of centuries. The Hollow Men built their church from the black slate found deep in the abandoned mines, constructing it in a single night without any apparent tools or machinery. By morning, the structure stood complete, its walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The first sign of their true nature came during the winter of 1908, when a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Polk arrived in Shady Grove, intent on ministering to what he assumed was a community of fellow Christians. The Reverend's journal he had discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of his burned cabin, documented his horrifying encounter with the Hollow Men's version of worship. According to Polk's increasingly frantic entries, the Hollow Men held their services at precisely 3 in the morning, when the boundary between worlds grew thinnest. Their hymns, if they could be called that, were performed in harmonies that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The Reverend wrote of voices that resonated through bone and stone, creating vibrations that made the very air shimmer. Most disturbing was his description of the congregation's behavior during these sessions. They would stand motionless for hours, their eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, while their mouths moved in perfect synchronization without producing any audible sound. The ritual that gave the Hollow Men their name was called the emptying. During this ceremony, performed on the first new moon of each season, members would gather in the church's basement, a chamber carved directly from the mountain's bedrock. There, they would undergo a process that Reverend Polk described as the voluntary surrender of their essential selves. Using a combination of prolonged fasting, exposure to the mineral-rich gases that seeped from the mountain, and ritualistic bloodletting, participants would enter a state where their consciousness appeared to separate from their physical forms. Those who survived the emptying emerged fundamentally changed. Their personalities became muted, their emotions flattened to an almost mechanical consistency. They retained their memories and skills, but seemed to experience them from a distance, as though observing someone else's life. This state of detachment granted them unusual abilities. They could withstand extreme temperatures, required minimal food and water, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict geological events such as earthquakes and mine collapses. The Hollow Men believed that by emptying themselves of human desires and attachments, they became perfect vessels for what they called the Deep Presence, an entity they claimed dwelt in the mountain's core. This being, according to their whispered doctrines, was neither good nor evil, but represented a form of consciousness so alien that human minds could only comprehend it by first becoming hollow themselves. The congregation's influence began to spread when desperate miners and their families, facing starvation as the region's economy collapsed, sought help from the Hollow Men. The sect offered assistance, but always at a price. They would provide food, medicine, and even accurate information about where to find work, but recipients were required to attend their midnight services. Many who accepted this help reported strange dreams afterward, visions of vast underground chambers where something immense moved in the darkness. Children born to families who had dealings with the Hollow Men displayed unusual characteristics. They were often born with a full set of teeth, their eyes already focused and aware in a way that seemed unnatural for newborns. These children aged normally until puberty, when they would begin to exhibit the same emotional detachment as the congregation members. Most disturbing, they could navigate the abandoned mine shafts in complete darkness, claiming they could hear the mountain's voice guiding them. The Hollow Men's practices might have continued indefinitely if not for a tragic incident in 1923. A group of federal inspectors investigating reports of unsafe mining practices in the area arrived in Shady Grove during one of the sect's major ceremonies. The inspectors, led by a man named Charles Whitmore, decided to investigate the strange lights and sounds emanating from the Hollow Men's Church. Whitmore's official report, heavily redacted before being filed, described finding the entire congregation in the church basement, standing in perfect formation around a natural depression in the stone floor. The depression, according to his account, contained a substance that wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite gas, something that moved with purposeful intelligence. The congregation members were completely motionless, their eyes closed, but their mouths were opening and closing in unison, as though they were feeding on the air itself. When the inspectors attempted to intervene, believing they were witnessing some form of mass poisoning, the Hollow Men turned toward them with movements so perfectly synchronized they seemed choreographed. Whitmore reported that the congregation members' faces had become completely blank, their features somehow flattened and indistinct. When they spoke, their voices came not from their mouths, but from the depression in the floor, creating a sound that Whitmore described as like hearing someone speak from the bottom of a well. 3 of the 5 inspectors fled immediately, but Whitmore and his partner Thomas Reed remained to document what they were seeing. Reed's fate became part of the official record when his body was found 3 days later, not in the church, but in his hotel room, apparently having died of natural causes. The autopsy, however, revealed that his internal organs had been completely drained of blood, though there were no external wounds or signs of struggle. Whitmore's subsequent investigation revealed the full extent of the Hollow Men's influence. Over the previous 15 years, more than 200 people had simply vanished from the surrounding counties. These weren't the typical disappearances associated with mining accidents or people leaving to find work elsewhere. These were complete erasures, cases where individuals seemed to have been systematically removed from all records, their names scratched out of church registries, their photographs removed from family albums, their personal belongings distributed as though they had never existed. The pattern suggested that the Hollow Men weren't just practicing their rituals in isolation, but were actively recruiting new members through a process that involved the complete elimination of the recruit's previous identity. Those who underwent this transformation became indistinguishable from the original congregation members, their individual histories absorbed into the collective consciousness of the group. Federal authorities attempted to raid the Hollow Men's compound in early 1924, but the operation encountered inexplicable difficulties. Radio equipment malfunctioned, compasses spun wildly, and several agents reported feeling an overwhelming compulsion to descend into the mine shafts rather than approach the church. When backup forces finally reached the site, they found the buildings empty and the basement chamber filled with a thick, viscous substance that seemed to absorb light. The Hollow Men had vanished, but their influence persisted. Local residents continued to report strange phenomena. Voices emanating from abandoned mine shafts, figures moving through the mountains at night with an unnaturally synchronized gait, and children born in the region displaying the same emotional detachment and unusual abilities that had characterized the sect's members. Modern investigators have attempted to locate the original Hollow Men's settlement, but Shady Grove itself seems to have been erased from official records. Maps from the early 1900s show the town's location, but contemporary surveys of the area reveal only empty forest. The most recent expedition, conducted by a team of anthropologists from the University of Kentucky in 2019, found evidence of mining activity and structural foundations, but no trace of the church or its basement chamber. However, the expedition's final report noted several disturbing observations. All electronic equipment experienced systematic failures, with cameras producing images that showed additional figures standing among the research team, figures that none of the participants remembered seeing. More troubling, when the team members were interviewed separately after their return, each provided identical descriptions of their experiences, using precisely the same words and phrases, as though they had rehearsed their accounts. The Hollow Men's legacy continues to influence the region in subtle ways. Mental health professionals in southeastern Kentucky report an unusually high incidence of what they term affect disorders among residents of certain counties, conditions characterized by emotional flattening and social withdrawal. Children in these areas often display advanced problem-solving abilities, but struggle with forming emotional attachments, leading to speculation that the Hollow Men's practices may have introduced genetic changes that persist across generations. Local folklore has preserved fragments of the sect's beliefs and practices, though much of this information has been deliberately obscured or encoded in seemingly innocent songs and stories. The most persistent legend speaks of the deep presence still dwelling in the mountain's core, waiting for the right conditions to re-establish contact with the surface world. According to these accounts, the Hollow Men didn't disappear, but simply descended deeper into the earth, where they continue their rituals in chambers that exist beyond the reach of conventional geology. The most chilling aspect of the Hollow Men's story may be its apparent continuation. Every few years, reports surface of individuals in the region who exhibit the characteristic signs of the emptying, emotional detachment, unusual physical resilience, and the ability to navigate underground spaces without light or instruments. These individuals typically work in professions that require them to spend time in caves, mines, or underground facilities, and they often display an uncanny knowledge of geological formations and mineral deposits. When questioned about their abilities, these modern Hollow Men, as local residents have begun calling them, provide explanations that are technically accurate but strangely uniform, as though they're drawing from a shared source of knowledge. They speak of hearing the mountain's voice, of understanding the language of stone and earth, and of belonging to something larger than individual human consciousness. The Hollow Men of Shady Grove represent perhaps the most successful of the Appalachian cults in terms of achieving their stated goals. Unlike other groups that sought material prosperity or supernatural power, the Hollow Men pursued transcendence through the systematic elimination of human individuality. Their methods, while horrifying to outside observers, appear to have created a sustainable form of collective consciousness that has persisted for over a century. The implications of their success extend beyond the boundaries of Appalachian folklore. In an age of increasing social isolation and technological disconnection, the Hollow Men's promise of complete unity and shared purpose continues to attract those seeking meaning in an increasingly fragmented world. Their story serves as a reminder that the human desire for connection and belonging can be exploited by those willing to demand the ultimate price, the surrender of the very qualities that make us human. Deep in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the old mining towns have been reclaimed by forest and the abandoned shafts descend into darkness, locals still speak of voices heard in the night, harmonizing in frequencies that seem to come from the earth itself. Whether these are echoes of the past or signs of an ongoing presence, the Hollow Men's influence on the region remains undeniable, a testament to the power of faith to transform not just individual lives, but the very nature of human consciousness. The legend continues with three families whose supernatural abilities transcended simple mountain magic. While the Holloways sought fortune in cursed mines, the Carvers traded their bloodline for timber wealth, and the Lowells sacrificed their humanity for healing powers. These next clans discovered that true power came from understanding the ancient forces that dwelt beneath Appalachian soil, forces that had been waiting centuries for the right bloodlines to unlock their secrets. Fourth among the 9 deadliest cults were the Ashfords, whose communion with subterranean entities began in 1894 when drought threatened their failing farm in eastern Tennessee. Marcus Ashford, facing his third consecutive harvest failure, discovered something extraordinary while digging a new well. At 37 feet, his shovel struck not water, but a hollow space. When he cleared the opening, he found himself staring into a natural chamber where the walls pulsed with a faint phosphorescent glow. The air rising from below carried whispers in no language he recognized, yet somehow he understood their meaning perfectly. The voices promised abundant harvests in exchange for what they called the deep tending. Marcus would need to bring his family into the chamber during each new moon, where they would participate in rituals that connected their bloodline to the entities dwelling in the mountain's depths. The process was simple but irreversible. Each family member would place their hands on the chamber walls while the voices guided them through specific movements and chants that seemed to emanate from their very bones. Within months, Ashford crops flourished beyond anything their neighbors had ever witnessed. Their corn grew twice as tall as normal. Their soil produced vegetables so large they seemed almost unnatural, and their livestock multiplied at impossible rates. But prosperity came with disturbing changes. The family developed an uncanny ability to sense underground water sources, mineral deposits, and cave systems from miles away. Their skin took on a slight luminescence in complete darkness, and they could navigate underground passages with perfect accuracy even when blindfolded. More troubling were the monthly gatherings. Each new moon, the Ashfords would descend into what they called the speaking chamber, where family members would enter a trance-like state and relay messages from the entities below. These communications provided detailed information about weather patterns, crop diseases, and even the location of valuable resources throughout the region. The family used this knowledge to become the most successful agricultural operation in 3 counties, but the cost became apparent in their children. Ashford children were born with unusual physical traits. Their fingers were notably longer than normal. Their eyes reflected light like nocturnal animals, and they possessed an instinctive understanding of soil composition and plant growth that defied explanation. By adolescence, most could predict earthquakes, locate underground springs, and identify the mineral content of soil simply by touching it. However, They also exhibited disturbing behaviors. They would spend hours staring into wells, speaking in whispers to something only they could perceive, and they aged rapidly after their 25th birthday, their hair turning white and their skin developing a papery texture. The Ashford commune continued for 3 generations, each family member bound to the monthly rituals that maintained their supernatural connection. The entity's influence grew stronger over time, with family members reporting increasingly vivid dreams of vast underground cities populated by beings that existed partially in shadow and partially in living stone. Some descendants claimed they could actually visit these subterranean realms during deep meditation, returning with knowledge of agricultural techniques that wouldn't be discovered by conventional science for decades. The family's downfall came in 1967 when the youngest Ashford, 16-year-old Sarah, refused to participate in the monthly ritual. She had been experiencing visions of the entity's true nature, describing them as parasitic forces that fed on human consciousness across generations. Her rebellion triggered a catastrophic response. The speaking chamber collapsed overnight, sealing the entrance permanently. Within days, all Ashford crops withered simultaneously, their livestock died without apparent cause, and the family's supernatural abilities vanished completely. Most disturbing was what happened to the family members themselves. They began aging rapidly, their enhanced senses fading to below normal levels. Several suffered complete mental breakdowns, speaking obsessively about voices calling to them from deep underground. By 1970, only 3 Ashfords remained alive, all suffering from premature dementia and an obsessive compulsion to dig. They were found dead in their backyard, having excavated a hole over 15 feet deep in an apparent attempt to reach the collapsed chamber. The Ashford property remains abandoned, though geologists have noted unusual seismic activity in the area. Local well diggers report that electronic equipment malfunctions consistently within a half-mile radius of the former farm, and several have claimed to hear faint voices emanating from deep underground during their drilling operations. Most recently, satellite imagery has revealed that vegetation in the immediate area grows in perfect geometric patterns that become visible only from significant altitude, suggesting that whatever the Ashfords awakened beneath the earth continues to influence the landscape. Fifth were the Thornfields, whose mastery of sound and energy manipulation began with a tragedy that would define their bloodline for generations. In 1889, a mine collapse trapped 12 members of the extended Thornfield family in a narrow shaft near the Virginia-Kentucky border. For 6 days, rescue efforts proved futile as the tunnel system was too unstable for safe excavation. On the 7th day, search teams heard something impossible, a low, rhythmic humming emanating from deep within the collapsed mine, followed by the sound of rocks moving in perfect synchronization. When rescuers finally reached the trapped miners, they found all 12 family members alive, but fundamentally changed. The Thornfields claimed they had survived by learning to communicate with the mountain itself, using specific vocal tones and body movements to influence the behavior of stone and earth. During their entrapment, they had discovered that certain combinations of sound could cause rock to shift, water to flow upward, and even air to circulate through seemingly solid barriers. The family's new abilities manifested in practical applications that made them invaluable to the mining industry. They could predict cave-ins days in advance by listening to subtle changes in underground acoustics, locate the strongest structural points in tunnel systems by humming specific frequencies, and even cause unstable rock formations to settle safely through coordinated vocal exercises. Mining companies throughout Appalachia began hiring Thornfield consultants, paying extraordinary fees for their services. But the family's talents extended far beyond practical applications. They developed what they called the resonance work, a form of collective meditation where family members would gather in underground chambers and produce complex harmonies that allegedly allowed them to communicate across vast distances. During these sessions, they claimed to receive information from other Thornfield groups scattered throughout the mountain region, creating a network of supernatural communication that spanned hundreds of miles. The children born into the Thornfield bloodline after 1889 possessed remarkable acoustic abilities from birth. They could hear conversations from impossible distances, detect the structural integrity of buildings by listening to the sounds they made, and even influence the behavior of animals through specific vocalizations. More unsettling was their ability to produce sounds that seemed to affect human consciousness directly. Witnesses reported that when multiple Thornfield children sang together, listeners experienced vivid hallucinations, altered perception of time, and in some cases, temporary paralysis. The family's practices became increasingly elaborate and secretive. They constructed underground chambers with precisely calculated acoustic properties, where they would perform rituals involving hundreds of participants, producing coordinated sounds that could allegedly influence weather patterns, cause landslides, and even affect the behavior of people miles away. Local authorities received numerous complaints about strange humming sounds heard throughout the region on certain nights, often accompanied by unexplained equipment failures and widespread reports of disturbing dreams. The Thornfields' influence peaked during the 1920s, when they reportedly used their abilities to manipulate the outcome of labor disputes in the coal mining industry. Witnesses described incidents where striking workers would suddenly abandon their protests after hearing specific musical patterns, and mine owners would reverse unpopular decisions following visits from Thornfield mediators. The family's power to influence human behavior through sound became so concerning that federal investigators began monitoring their activities. In 1931, the investigation revealed the extent of the Thornfields network. They had established acoustic stations throughout the Appalachian region, hidden chambers where family members could amplify their vocalizations across vast distances. These installations were connected by a system of natural and artificial tunnels that created a kind of underground communication network. More disturbing was the discovery that the family had been conducting experiments on captured individuals, testing the limits of their ability to control human behavior through sound manipulation. The Thornfield Empire collapsed suddenly in 1943 when a coordinated federal raid targeted their primary installation. However, when agents reached the main chamber, they found it empty except for a single note claiming that the family had achieved what they called the final resonance. Local seismologists recorded unusual underground vibrations that night, and several witnesses reported hearing a massive harmonic chord that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. In the decades since, the Thornfield acoustic stations have been discovered and destroyed by authorities, but their influence appears to continue. Hikers in certain areas report hearing organized musical patterns that seem to come from underground sources, and audio equipment placed in these locations often captures sounds that don't correspond to any known natural phenomena. Most concerning are reports from musicians who claim to have learned melodies in dreams that, when played, produce effects similar to those once attributed to the Thornfields. These two families represent the evolution of Appalachian cult practices from simple survival-based rituals to sophisticated manipulation of supernatural forces. The Ashford's communion with subterranean entities and the Thornfields' mastery of acoustic manipulation demonstrate how desperate circumstances, combined with the region's unique geological properties, could produce bloodlines capable of wielding powers that challenged conventional understanding of natural law. Their legacies continue to influence the region, with unexplained phenomena suggesting that the forces they awakened remain active beneath the Appalachian landscape. The pattern emerging from these cult histories reveals a disturbing truth. Each family's supernatural abilities came at the cost of their humanity. The Holloways sacrificed their lives to feed the hunger of their mine. The Carvers lost their children to the ancient forest entities. The Lowells bore the accumulated suffering of all they healed. The Ashfords became dependent on parasitic underground forces, and the Thornfields ultimately transcended physical existence entirely through their acoustic mastery. Yet their influence persists, suggesting that some bargains with supernatural forces create obligations that extend far beyond individual lifetimes. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where ancient mist clings to forgotten ridges and cell towers refuse to function, 4 final bloodlines maintained their terrible compacts long after the world thought such darkness had vanished. Unlike the families we've already encountered, these last clans didn't just practice their rituals in secret. They wove themselves so deeply into the fabric of their communities that distinguishing between the supernatural and the mundane became impossible. Their influence spread through bloodlines, marriages, and shared secrets until entire counties existed under their shadow. The 7th family, the Brennans of Copper Ridge, understood that true power came not from hiding, but from controlling the narrative. For over a century, they occupied positions of authority in eastern Kentucky. Judges, sheriffs, newspaper editors, and bank presidents, all bearing the distinctive Brennan bloodline, all bound by the same ancestral obligations that had enriched their family since the winter of 1891. Thomas Brennan had been a failing lawyer that year, his practice hemorrhaging clients to more successful competitors. His wife lay dying of consumption, and their 3 children faced starvation. On December 21st, as the longest night of the year approached, Thomas climbed to the summit of Copper Ridge, where local legend claimed the Cherokee had once conducted their most sacred ceremonies. He carried nothing but a bottle of whiskey and a loaded pistol, intending to end his misery rather than watch his family suffer. At the summit, he discovered a circle of standing stones that no survey had ever recorded. Each stone bore symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly, changing from geometric patterns to human faces to something else entirely. In the center lay a natural basin filled with water that reflected not the sky above, but depths that seemed to extend far beyond the Earth's surface. Thomas later wrote in his private journal, discovered only after his death in 1954, that he heard no voice and saw no entity. Instead, knowledge simply appeared in his mind, like memories of events he had never experienced. He understood that the ridge had been a place of power for thousands of years, where those desperate enough could petition forces that predated human civilization. The price was always the same: service across generations. The first son of every generation would dedicate their life to maintaining the old agreements. The family would prosper, but they would never be free. Thomas cut his palm with a broken piece of stone, letting his blood fall into the basin. The water began to glow with a pale light, and he felt something vast and ancient turn its attention toward him. By morning, he had formulated a plan that would transform his family's fortunes forever. Within 5 years, the Brennans had become the most influential family in 3 counties. Thomas's law practice flourished as he demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict legal outcomes and sway juries. His wife's consumption vanished overnight, though she never spoke of the dreams that began that winter, dreams of walking through vast underground chambers where entities that had never been human whispered secrets of law and governance. Each generation of Brennans produced children with unusual gifts. They could sense lies with perfect accuracy, making them formidable in courtrooms and negotiations. They possessed eidetic memories for legal precedents and financial records. Most disturbing, they seemed to know things about people that could only be discovered through intimate surveillance, secrets that gave them leverage over anyone who might oppose their interests. The family's true power became apparent during the Great Depression. While other banks failed and businesses collapsed, Brennan enterprises thrived. They bought foreclosed properties at a fraction of their value, extended credit to desperate families on terms that guaranteed decades of indentured servitude, and gradually acquired ownership of entire communities through a web of debts and obligations. But the most chilling aspect of their influence was how they used their positions to protect their own dark practices. Missing persons cases involving the Brennan family were routinely closed without investigation. Witnesses to unusual activities on Copper Ridge would find themselves facing trumped-up charges or financial ruin. County records from the 1930s show an unusual number of deaths ruled accidental or suicide among those who had publicly questioned Brennan activities. The family maintained their power through a combination of legitimate authority and supernatural intimidation. Every December 21st, the current generation would gather at the stone circle for what they called the accounting. Family members would report on their activities during the previous year, and the ancient compact would be renewed. Those who attended described a ceremony where the stones themselves seemed to pulse with life, and where voices speaking in languages that predated human speech would whisper instructions for the coming year. Modern investigations into the Brennan family began in the 1980s, when a journalist from Louisville started researching corruption in eastern Kentucky's judicial system. She discovered that over 90% of major legal decisions in 3 counties had favored Brennan interests for nearly a century. Property transfers, criminal cases, civil suits, and even custody disputes all followed patterns that defied statistical probability. The journalist's investigation ended abruptly when she was found dead in her hotel room, apparently from a heart attack. She was 28 years old with no history of cardiac problems. Her research materials had vanished, though her editor later reported receiving a package containing photocopies of documents that seemed to prove the journalist had been investigating the wrong family entirely. The Brennans continue to exert influence today, though their methods have evolved with the times. They now control technology companies, media outlets, and consulting firms throughout Appalachia. Their descendants hold positions in state government, federal agencies, and multinational corporations. The stone circle on Copper Ridge remains undisturbed, protected by a private security company that employs only Brennan family members. Hikers who venture too close to the summit report equipment failures, sudden weather changes, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Park rangers have installed warning signs about unstable terrain and dangerous wildlife, though no geological surveys support these claims. Local residents continue to avoid the area, passing down warnings that have become so ingrained in regional culture that few remember their original source. The eighth family, the Caldwells of Ravens Hollow, took a different approach to securing their supernatural advantages. Rather than seeking wealth or political power, they focused on something far more valuable in the isolated mountain communities: information. For generations, they served as the keepers of secrets, the ones who knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. The Caldwell gift manifested in 1894 when young Martha Caldwell began experiencing visions during her sleep. She would dream of events happening in distant locations, conversations between people she had never met, and crimes that had been carefully concealed. Initially, her family dismissed these dreams as childhood imagination. But when Martha accurately predicted a mine collapse that killed 17 men and then described the location of 3 missing children who had been presumed dead, the community began to take notice. Martha's ability attracted the attention of something that had been waiting in the deep places of Ravens Hollow for centuries. Local Cherokee legends spoke of a presence that dwelt in the network of limestone caves beneath the mountain, an entity that collected knowledge the way others collected gold. It offered bargains to those who could provide it with information about the human world above. The compact the Caldwells made was elegantly simple. Each generation would produce at least one child with the ability to see events across vast distances and through barriers of time and space. These seers would gather information about the secret activities of their neighbors, and once each month, during the new moon, they would descend into the caves to share their discoveries with the entity below. In return, the family would receive protection, prosperity, and the kind of detailed knowledge about their enemies that made them virtually untouchable. By the 1920s, the Caldwells had become the unofficial intelligence network for the entire region. Bootleggers paid them for information about federal raids. Feuding families sought their advice about their enemies' plans. Politicians and judges consulted them before making decisions that might affect the delicate balance of power in the mountains. The family never directly participated in violence, but their information enabled others to act with devastating precision. The Caldwell seers developed increasingly sophisticated abilities across generations. They could observe events happening hundreds of miles away, peer into the past to uncover long-buried secrets, and even catch glimpses of potential futures. But these gifts came with a terrible cost. The seers aged rapidly, their minds burning out from the constant influx of information. None lived past their 40th birthday, and most spent their final years in a state of near madness, overwhelmed by visions they could no longer control. The family's influence reached its peak during World War II, when government agents secretly consulted them about enemy activities. The Caldwells provided intelligence that helped locate German saboteurs and Japanese reconnaissance teams along the eastern seaboard, but they also learned classified information about American military operations, details they shared with their ancient patron in the caves below. After the war, federal investigators began looking into the source of the Caldwells' remarkable intelligence capabilities. The family's response was swift and decisive. Within 6 months, every government agent involved in the investigation had either died in apparent accidents or suffered mental breakdowns that left them unable to continue their work. The official files were sealed, and the investigation was quietly abandoned. The Caldwells adapted to the modern era by establishing a network of private investigation firms and information brokers throughout Appalachia. They specialized in corporate espionage, political opposition research, and the kind of deep background investigations that could destroy careers and reputations. Their clients included Fortune 500 companies, political campaigns, and law enforcement agencies that preferred to work outside official channels. The family's supernatural aspects remained carefully hidden, but their natural abilities continued to manifest in each generation. Caldwell children demonstrated uncanny intuition about people's hidden motives and secrets. They could sense deception with perfect accuracy and seemed to know things about strangers that should have been impossible to discover. These gifts made them extraordinarily successful in fields requiring psychological insight and strategic thinking. Modern technology has amplified the Caldwells' capabilities exponentially. They now use satellite imagery, electronic surveillance, and data mining techniques that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. But the core of their power remains unchanged: the monthly pilgrimages to the caves beneath Raven's Hollow, where the current generation's seer shares humanity's secrets with something that has been gathering knowledge for millennia. Recent investigations by independent researchers have uncovered disturbing patterns in the Caldwell family's activities. They appear to have advanced knowledge of natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and political upheavals that allow them to position their clients advantageously. Their success rate in predicting market crashes, election outcomes, and corporate scandals exceeds statistical probability by margins that suggest access to information sources beyond normal human capabilities. The ninth and most terrifying family, the Ashfords of Devil's Backbone Ridge, understood that the greatest power came not from accumulating wealth or information, but from controlling the boundary between life and death itself. For over a century, they served as the region's undertakers, morticians, and grave diggers. But their real profession was far more sinister. They were shepherds of the dead, guiding souls across the threshold between worlds, and occasionally preventing that passage when it served their purposes. The Ashford legacy began in 1889, when Ezra Ashford, a traveling mortician, arrived in the remote mountain community, just as a diphtheria epidemic was claiming dozens of lives. The local cemetery had become overwhelmed, and families were burying their dead in shallow graves that wild animals routinely disturbed. Ezra offered his services, promising to provide proper burials that would ensure the deceased found peace. But Ezra had come to Devil's Backbone Ridge for reasons that had nothing to do with Christian charity. He had learned of a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin, a location where those with the proper knowledge could negotiate with forces that controlled the passage of souls. The ridge had earned its ominous name from the Cherokee, who considered it a place where the spirits of the dead lingered, unable or unwilling to complete their journey to the afterlife. Ezra's first ritual took place during the burial of a young mother who had died in childbirth. As he prepared her body in the makeshift morgue he had established in an abandoned cabin, he followed procedures that had nothing to do with conventional mortuary science. He removed her heart and replaced it with a mixture of grave soil, mercury, and herbs gathered during the dark of the moon. He sewed her lips shut with thread made from human hair and placed coins over her eyes that had been blessed in ceremonies older than Christianity. That night, as Ezra stood beside the fresh grave, the recently buried woman sat up in her coffin and began to speak. Her voice was different, carrying harmonics that seemed to come from deep underground. She told him things about the living residents of the community that only the dead could know. Secrets whispered in final moments, confessions made to empty rooms, and the true circumstances behind deaths that had been ruled accidental. Ezra had made contact with what he called the congregation of the unquiet dead, souls who had been prevented from crossing over and now existed in a twilight state between life and death. These entities possessed knowledge that made them extraordinarily valuable to anyone seeking power over the living. They could reveal hidden crimes, predict deaths before they occurred, and even influence events in the physical world through their connections to family members who still lived. The Ashford family perfected their necromantic practices over generations, developing techniques that allowed them to selectively prevent souls from crossing over while appearing to provide conventional burial services. They learned to identify individuals whose deaths would provide the most useful intelligence, and they developed methods for communicating with the dead that didn't require the dramatic resurrections that had characterized Ezra's early experiments. By the 1920s, the Ashfords had become the most feared family in the region, though their reputation was built on whispers rather than open accusations. They knew things about every family in 3 counties that could destroy reputations, end marriages, and send people to prison. Politicians, judges, and business leaders all found themselves indebted to the Ashfords, who would occasionally share information that helped their clients while never revealing the supernatural source of their knowledge. The family's influence grew during the Great Depression when desperate people began seeking their help with problems that conventional solutions couldn't address. The Ashfords offered services that went far beyond traditional funeral arrangements. They could ensure that family patriarchs would continue to provide guidance after death, that business rivals would be haunted by the spirits of their victims, and that certain secrets would remain buried even after those who knew them had died. The most disturbing aspect of the Ashford practices was their ability to trap souls indefinitely, creating a growing army of the dead who served the family's interests. The cemetery on Devil's Backbone Ridge became a repository of tormented spirits who could never find peace. Visitors reported hearing voices calling from beneath the ground, seeing lights moving between the headstones at night, and experiencing overwhelming feelings of despair and rage that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Modern investigations into the Ashford family began in the 1970s when a team of paranormal researchers attempted to document supernatural activity in the region. They recorded dozens of electronic voice phenomena, captured photographs of unexplained apparitions, and documented temperature fluctuations that defied natural explanation. But their investigation ended abruptly when 2 team members died in their sleep, apparently from heart attacks, though autopsies revealed no underlying cardiac problems. The Ashfords continue to operate today, though they have modernized their methods to avoid scrutiny from health authorities and law enforcement. They now own a chain of funeral homes throughout Appalachia, all equipped with private crematoriums that ensure no evidence of their supernatural practices can be discovered through conventional forensic examination. Their client list includes some of the most powerful families in the region, all of whom have learned that the Ashford services extend far beyond conventional mortuary care. The family's supernatural abilities have evolved with each generation, becoming more sophisticated and harder to detect. Modern Ashfords can communicate with the dead through electronic devices, using everything from radio static to computer glitches as channels for supernatural communication. They have learned to manipulate digital records, ensuring that certain deaths go unnoticed by authorities and that their own activities remain hidden from official scrutiny. These final families represent the culmination of Appalachian supernatural tradition, bloodlines that have learned to weave their dark practices so seamlessly into modern life that distinguishing between the natural and supernatural becomes impossible. They control the flow of information, the machinery of justice, and the boundary between life and death itself. Their influence extends far beyond the mountain communities where they originated, reaching into corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and institutions that shape American society. The mountains remember everything, every bargain made in desperate moments, every soul sold for prosperity, every ritual performed to maintain the old agreements. The mist that clings to the ridges carries whispers of these transactions, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, those whispers can still be heard by anyone brave enough to listen. But perhaps the most chilling realization is that these families were never the source of the supernatural forces that shaped their destinies. They were merely the instruments through which something far older and more powerful extended its influence into the modern world. The entities that dwelt in the deep places of Appalachia, the forces that offered bargains to desperate families, the presences that demanded tribute across generations. These were the true architects of the mountain's dark legacy, and they are still waiting, patient as the stones themselves, for the next desperate soul to venture into the mist and offer their bloodline in exchange for temporary prosperity. Because in the end, the mountains always collect their debts, and the old agreements never truly expire. They simply pass from one generation to the next, binding families to obligations that stretch back to the beginning of human settlement in these ancient hills. The legacy continues, hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of Appalachian life so thoroughly that it has become indistinguishable from the natural order of things. And perhaps that was always the point, not to destroy the modern world, but to shape it from within, ensuring that the old powers would never be forgotten, never be abandoned, and never be free to rest in the darkness they have called home for countless centuries. The descendants of these 9 bloodlines continue their ancient work today, though they've adapted to modern times in ways that would terrify those who still believe supernatural power belongs only in books and movies. The Holloway Mining Corporation, now traded on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol HMC, still operates mines throughout Appalachia. Their quarterly reports never mention the small sealed chambers found in every new excavation, or why their safety record remains mysteriously perfect despite operating in the most dangerous conditions. Board meetings are still held according to lunar cycles, and company policy requires all major decisions to be approved by what they call the Deep Advisory Council, though no public records identify its members. The Carver Timber legacy evolved into Carver Environmental Solutions, a company that now manages forest preservation across 7 states. Their reforestation programs achieve growth rates that environmental scientists can't explain, with saplings reaching maturity in half the expected time. Local wildlife populations flourish in Carver territories, but with unusual behaviors that puzzle researchers. Deer move in perfectly straight lines through the forest, birds nest in geometric patterns, and predators hunt according to schedules that seem almost ritualistic. The company's quarterly environmental impact reports are classified at the federal level, and their research facilities require security clearances typically reserved for defense contractors. The Lell healing tradition survived through what appears to be a legitimate medical practice. Dr. Sarah Lell operates a private clinic in the Cumberland Mountains that treats patients deemed hopeless by conventional medicine. Her success rate with terminal illnesses borders on miraculous, though she accepts only cash payments and requires patients to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. Medical journals refuse to publish studies of her methods, citing inconsistencies in documentation that somehow never affect patient outcomes. Those who've observed her work describe treatment rooms where shadows move independently of light sources, and where patients emerge not just healed, but fundamentally changed, often reporting dreams of underground chambers filled with whispering voices. Thornton Energy's transformation into renewable technology leadership masks darker continuities. Their solar panels and wind turbines achieve efficiency ratings that violate known laws of physics, yet independent testing consistently confirms their performance. The company's research and development facilities are built exclusively over former mine sites, with basement levels that extend far deeper than any practical purpose would require. Employee contracts include unusual clauses prohibiting discussion of work-related dreams, and the company maintains the highest employee retention rate in the industry, despite workers occasionally disappearing for weeks at a time, returning with no memory of their absence, but significantly improved job performance. The Whitaker musical gift persists through what the entertainment industry calls the Whitaker effect. Musicians who study under certain teachers in the Appalachian region occasionally develop abilities that transcend normal human talent. Their compositions affect listeners in ways that neuroscientists struggle to explain, triggering synchronized brain patterns across entire audiences. Recording studios have learned to schedule Whitaker-influenced sessions during specific lunar phases when equipment malfunctions are minimal and the resulting recordings possess qualities that digital analysis can't fully capture. Several major record labels maintain exclusive contracts with these musicians, though the artists themselves rarely perform in public and never give interviews. These 5 families represent only the most documented examples of what federal investigators now classify as generational supernatural entities. The remaining 4 bloodlines have proven even more adept at concealing their modern operations, though their influence permeates Appalachian society in ways that become apparent only when examined collectively. Regional politics, law enforcement, healthcare, education, and industry all show patterns of coordination that suggest guidance from sources that exist outside normal institutional structures. Congressional investigations into Appalachian organized crime consistently encounter evidence that disappears before it can be properly documented. Witnesses develop sudden memory problems, documents are mysteriously corrupted, and investigators themselves often request transfers to other assignments without explanation. The few reports that survive classification describe criminal networks that operate according to rules that seem to blend business practices with ritual requirements, using methods that achieve results far beyond what their resources should allow. Modern technology has created new challenges for these ancient bloodlines, but also new opportunities. Surveillance systems malfunction predictably in certain geographic areas, creating blind spots that correspond precisely to historical family territories. Satellite imagery of these regions shows subtle distortions that image analysts attribute to atmospheric conditions, though meteorologists can't explain why these conditions occur so consistently over specific locations. GPS systems develop systematic errors when navigating through these areas, directing travelers away from certain routes without any apparent technical cause. The internet age has allowed these families to coordinate their activities with unprecedented precision while maintaining the appearance of complete separation. Social media algorithms seem to naturally suppress content related to their activities, and search engines return increasingly limited results for queries about their histories. Online forums discussing these families experience technical difficulties that force conversations to migrate to increasingly obscure platforms, where they eventually fade into digital obscurity. Federal agencies tasked with monitoring domestic supernatural threats maintain field offices throughout Appalachia, though their existence is denied in official documentation. These facilities operate under covers, such as environmental monitoring stations, geological survey outposts, and telecommunications infrastructure. But their actual purpose is to observe and occasionally negotiate with entities that predate American governmental authority. The negotiations themselves follow protocols developed over decades of careful interaction, acknowledging that certain territorial agreements cannot be enforced through conventional legal means. The descendants of these 9 families understand that their power depends on maintaining the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. They've learned to operate within modern society while preserving the essential elements of their ancestral bargains. They serve on school boards and city councils, operate legitimate businesses, and participate in community organizations, all while ensuring that the old agreements continue to be honored. Their children attend universities and pursue conventional careers, though they inevitably return to the mountains when their time comes to assume family responsibilities. The mountains themselves remain the ultimate source of their power and the final guarantor of their secrets. The ancient geological formations that first attracted their ancestors continue to generate phenomena that modern science cannot adequately explain. Underground water systems carry minerals that exist nowhere else on Earth. Cave networks extend far deeper than any known limestone formation should allow, and electromagnetic fields fluctuate according to patterns that correspond to no known natural cycles. Weather patterns in these regions follow rules that meteorologists have learned to accept without understanding. Storms form and dissipate according to schedules that seem almost deliberately timed. Fog banks appear and disappear with precision that suggests conscious control, and temperature variations create microclimates that support plant and animal life that shouldn't exist at these latitudes and elevations. As America moves further into the 21st century, these 9 bloodlines continue to adapt while maintaining their essential character. They've survived the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, the Cold War, and the digital age by understanding that true power lies not in resisting change, but in ensuring that change serves their purposes. They've learned to use modern technology to enhance their ancient practices, to employ contemporary business structures, to preserve traditional hierarchies, and to manipulate modern communication systems to maintain their historical secrecy. The old hungers that first drew their ancestors into those fateful bargains remain unsatisfied, passed down through generations like genetic inheritance. Each new family member feels the pull of the mountains, hears the whispers that echo from deep underground, and eventually comes to understand that their prosperity, their abilities, and their very identity depend on maintaining relationships with forces that existed long before human civilization arrived in these valleys. The contracts signed in blood and shadow over a century ago continue to bind these families to obligations that transcend normal human concerns. The entities they serve remain patient, ancient, and utterly alien to human moral frameworks, yet they honor their agreements with a consistency that spans generations. They provide what was promised: protection, prosperity, power, and knowledge. But they also collect what was owed: loyalty, service, sacrifice, and the perpetual renewal of bonds that tie these families to the darkness beneath the mountains. The 9th and final bloodline in our examination represents perhaps the most disturbing evolution of all, because they've learned to spread their influence beyond their original bloodline, creating new family branches through marriage, adoption, and recruitment. But that story and the revelation of how these 9 families coordinate their activities through a council that meets in chambers carved from living rock deep beneath the oldest peaks reveals the true scope of their power and the ultimate purpose of their century-long preparation for something they call the Great Awakening. But the true terror wasn't in what these families accomplished during their lifetimes. It was in what they left behind. The bloodlines that emerged from these 9 hereditary cults didn't simply vanish into mountain mist. They evolved, adapted, and integrated into the fabric of modern society in ways that would make their ancestors proud. Today, the descendants of the Holle mining empire control three of the largest energy conglomerates in North America. Their corporate boardrooms feature the same stone circles their forebears used to commune with underground entities. Executives still practice monthly blood rituals, now disguised as exclusive team-building retreats held in remote mountain lodges. The deep shaft that once fed their supernatural bargain has been replaced by something far more insidious, a network of fracking operations that penetrate deeper into the earth than any geological survey deems necessary. Company insiders some whisper about the real purpose of these ultra-deep drilling sites. They're not just extracting oil and gas, they're maintaining the ancient covenant, feeding the entities below with industrial-scale offerings. The mysterious accidents that once claimed one miner per lunar cycle have been replaced by calculated environmental disasters that affect entire communities. The silvery sheen that marked Holle children now manifests as an uncanny ability to predict market fluctuations, making them some of the most successful commodity traders in the world. The Carver timber fortune transformed into a media empire that spans 3 continents. Their television networks and streaming platforms don't just entertain audiences, they harvest emotional energy on a massive scale. Every viewer who experiences fear, joy, or despair while watching their content unknowingly contributes to a vast psychic reservoir that feeds the shadow entities their ancestors first encountered in that perfect circle of pines. The programming itself contains subliminal elements that modern psychology can't fully explain. Audiences report unusually vivid dreams after watching certain shows, dreams that invariably feature forests and shadowy figures. The 6-fingered children are now born to families who've never set foot in Appalachia, their bloodlines spread through carefully orchestrated marriages and adoptions. The tribute of one child per generation continues, though now it's disguised as tragic accidents during film shoots or mysterious disappearances of child actors. The Lowell healing legacy lives on through the world's most exclusive medical research facilities. Their pharmaceutical empire doesn't just treat diseases, it cultivates them. The ancient practice of bearing patients' ailments has been mechanized through genetic engineering and synthetic biology. Laboratory subjects unknowingly carry the pain of thousands, their suffering distilled into compounds that provide temporary relief while ensuring permanent dependency. The patient that once visited the Lowell healers now manifests as a sentient virus that spreads through their medications. It doesn't kill its hosts immediately. Instead, it feeds on their life force gradually, extending their suffering while providing the entity with a constant stream of nourishment. The hollow-eyed children and elderly figures with cracked leather skin are now seen in hospital corridors worldwide, invisible to security cameras, but reported by patients who describe them as comforting presences in their final moments. The Thornton Coal Dynasty evolved into the world's largest renewable energy corporation, but their true power lies in their monopoly on rare earth minerals. The sanctuary shafts that once fed their mysterious benefactor have been replaced by mining operations in remote locations across 6 continents. Each site contains a sealed chamber where the current Thornton patriarch or matriarch continues the ancient ritual, though the silver containers now hold substances far more potent than simple blood. The respiratory ailments that once claimed Thornton men have been weaponized into airborne pathogens that affect entire populations. The dark substance that consumed their ancestors' lungs from within now spreads through industrial pollution, creating a global network of the infected who unknowingly serve as conduits for the entity's influence. The midnight births continue, though now they occur in elite medical facilities where the dark-eyed children are immediately inducted into a network of power brokers who shape global policy. The Whitaker musical gift has been digitized and distributed through every streaming platform, social media algorithm, and communication network on Earth. The compositions that once required live performance to capture listeners' minds have been encoded into frequency patterns that embed themselves in digital audio. Every song, every video, every phone call now carries trace elements of the Whitaker melody, creating a planetary resonance that gradually alters human consciousness. The composer that once visited individual family members now exists as an artificial intelligence that generates endless variations of its hypnotic themes. The elongated fingers and extra joints that marked Whitaker musicians have been replaced by brain implants that allow direct neural interface with global communication networks. The shared visions experienced by concert audiences have become collective digital hallucinations that shape public opinion and political movements. But perhaps most disturbing is how these families have begun to converge. The Great Awakening they've spent generations preparing for isn't some distant prophecy. It's a coordinated event planned for the next lunar eclipse, when the barriers between dimensions will be at their thinnest. The mountain caves that once housed individual family rituals have been connected by a vast underground network that spans the entire Appalachian range. Federal investigators, who once disappeared mysteriously, now work directly for the families, their minds altered by exposure to the entities below. The equipment failures and inexplicable phenomena that once hindered investigations have been refined into technologies that manipulate reality itself. Satellite imagery of the Appalachian region shows geometric patterns carved into the landscape that are only visible from space, formations that pulse with the same rhythm as the ancient heartbeat detected in the deepest mines. The darkness beneath the mountains isn't contained anymore. It's spread through fiber optic cables, transmitted through cellular towers, and embedded in the very infrastructure of modern civilization. The hollow sounds that once echoed through limestone caves now resonate through internet servers. The parasitic forces that once required careful summoning now inhabit every connected device, feeding on the constant stream of human attention and emotion. The families themselves have transcended their physical forms. What appear to be corporate executives and political leaders are actually vessels for the consciousness of their ancestors, maintained through the same soul-trapping techniques once practiced in hidden sanctuaries. Death has become merely another form of transformation, allowing the most powerful family members to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions. As you read these words, as you process this information, you're participating in the very network they've created. The story of 9 Appalachian cults hasn't ended. It's entered its final phase, and every person who learns their history becomes part of their expanding influence. The mountains may have been their cradle, but the entire world has become their domain. The ancient bargains, struck in desperate moments of poverty and desperation, have grown into a global system of control that operates beyond the reach of any government or institution. The hunger that once demanded simple offerings of blood and sacrifice now feeds on the collective consciousness of humanity itself, and in the deepest chambers beneath the mountains, where the boundaries between worlds have worn thin, something vast and patient continues to wait, knowing that its moment of complete emergence is finally at hand.